I hope you are all having a good evening, my dear listeners. It is about to begin another The Hour of Insanity, where reports, stories, and memories of the unexplainable travel through the airwaves to you. But be careful, because the next story could be yours. Today's story is called A Lighthouse in the Darkness. This report came to me from a trustworthy anonymous source in the city of Rockport. In my hands, I have copies of the local police department's report of an incident that the government preferred never to be made public. Until today. After a careful analysis of the testimonies of the survivor of a shipwreck near Beacon Island, you will know the truth of what happened on the night of April 12, 1926. On board the SS Essex County, in addition to the crew and other few passengers, were the antique dealer Ezekiel Berkey, the artist Andrea Bonucci, and a federal agent under the false name of Wallace Russell. Don't worry, dear listeners, all will be revealed and explained when the time comes. Ezekiel's pocket watch showed that it was 8:15 p.m. when he walked out onto the deck with Andrea and Wallace smoking a few cigarettes and looking out over the horizon. It was a night as dark as the waters the SS Essex County made its way through. Further ahead, flashes in the sky of a storm that was forming worried a little about how the rest of the trip would be. The cold wind brought a few small drops indicating that a storm, perhaps, was not that far away. At least the Beacon Island lighthouse lit the way to safety. That is, until all of a sudden it went out. It was one of those moments where you only realize how dark your surroundings are when the only source of light that really makes a difference goes out. With the clouds of a slowly approaching storm covering the moon and stars, the boat's lanterns were the only source of light nearby. Sea and sky seemed one and the same. The crew on the boat left the outer deck in search of the captain to find out what to do. A few minutes later, a noise that no one on board would have liked revealed the sad reality of the SS Essex County's future. The creak of the boat dragging itself over sharp rocks was answered by hurried sailors running everywhere. Ezekiel, Andrea, and Wallace looked at each other in fear of what would come next. It was then that a sailor went to their direction and said, "Follow me! It's not safe to be on board. We are releasing the boats now. You will have more chances if you row to Beacon Island." They were really far from the coast. When the light from the lighthouse went out, they were perhaps less than a kilometer from the island. There was no reluctance from the three men, since all their belongings were already in hand, and the alternative was to stay in a boat where, according to the screams, water was already entering the boiler. They followed the sailor to a part of the boat where they were preparing the small wooden boats for the few passengers on board. Ezekiel, Andrea, and Wallace entered without ceremony and waited with butterflies in their stomachs while the crew lowered the boat with the help of ropes towards the cold and dark water. With the thud of the wood hitting the water, they heard the sailors cry one last time. "Remember, head towards Beacon Island. The lighthouse may have gone out, but this is your best chance." Ezekiel and Wallace looked into the boat and found 2 pairs of oars. Without saying a word, they simply began rowing towards Beacon Island. Bad luck was already hanging over the fate of these men, but they didn't know how much. On the way to Beacon Island, while Wallace and Ezekiel rowed, Andrea felt a small wooden boat with peeling paint break the few waves that stood between them and the island. The wind that brought the taste of salt water and the rain that was getting closer strained his eyes, trying to see if other boats were going towards them. When suddenly, something caught his attention. What appeared to be metal plates faintly reflected the glow of a full moon that would soon be hidden by clouds. He leaned out of the boat, trying to understand what those metal plates were, and realized that perhaps the SS Essex County was not the first vessel to sink there. The artist's heart beat even faster with adrenaline. Had he discovered an ancient treasure? Are these 3 men sailing towards ruin? Images flashed through his mind, and he wished he had a covered place so he could translate his feelings onto paper. Despite the danger and uncertainty, he couldn't ignore the feeling of excitement coursing through his veins. He told the other 2 men only that maybe they weren't the first boat that wrecked in those waters, which made Wallace and Ezekiel row more vigorously the closer they got to the island. When the little wooden boat arrived on the old dock north of Beacon Island, the rain was already getting stronger. They pulled the boat onto the island so that their small craft would not be washed away by the sea. Already practically soaked, Ezekiel said that he knew the man who was at the lighthouse and that they could ask for shelter. They should radio for help. They should do something. Anything they could. Ezekiel was shouting the name of the lighthouse keeper, George Cassidy, as he walked along the small path that led to the lighthouse. Andrea followed him in silence. But Wallace, who had pulled a flashlight from his heavy overcoat, looked down and saw footprints leading towards the undergrowth. What you don't know, and neither did Wallace's other 2 companions in misfortune, is that he wasn't the only undercover federal agent on Beacon Island. In fact, he was meeting the next day in Rockport with Michael Turner, another agent investigating the possible smuggling routes that might pass through the island. But he didn't want to reveal his identity or put 2 innocent men at risk. So he simply ignored the footprints and followed his companions. After a few minutes walking, they have arrived at the lighthouse, still in darkness. The great structure, which rose towards the rainy sky, brought a mixture of relief for finally being able to shelter themselves from the rain, and fear for not knowing what could have happened for it to be out. Ezekiel opened the wooden door and entered, revealing a corridor lit by lamps, casting the shadows of them along the walls. Andrea and Wallace followed, relieved to finally find a place to take cover from the rain. Now it's the time where this story begins to show its true face. Because in a few steps, everything there would take a dark turn. The hallway led to a spiral staircase that led up to the lighthouse. But the base of the lighthouse looked like a small house with 2 doors on either side of the hall before the stairs. Ezekiel entered the first room, which was nothing more than a bedroom with an old bed and a bedside table beside it. He walked over to the bedside table to see if he could find any belongings that would indicate it belonged to his friend Cassidy. When he opened the drawer, he was surprised by 3 golden coins the size of the palm of his hand. Ezekiel took the coins, placing 2 in his coat pocket, and carefully examining the other he held in his hand. Listen at your own risk to the description of these coins, dear listeners, because according to Ezekiel's testimony, he wished these coins had never reached him. In a simple assessment, Mr. Berkey stated that the coins were pure gold, all of which were identical with strange symbols he had never seen before. Rudimentary designs that resembled anchors, fish, and other meaningless shapes. He was intrigued by those coins, and something in his mind seemed to understand that they were trying to communicate with him. He stared at the coin in his hand, mesmerized. Gradually, Ezekiel said that the sound around him became more and more muffled, as if there was nothing else in that place but him, the 2 gold coins that were in his pocket, and the one that he still held in his hand. The strange symbols made him lose track of what was real. He was being pulled into another world, one that was both enchanting and frightening. Wallace heard whispers coming from the room Ezekiel had entered, and when he peeked through the open door, he could see that Ezekiel was holding something in his hands, but he couldn't see what, as Mr. Berkey had his back to him. He called him by name a few times, but got no response. He turned on the flashlight and pointed it in the direction of Ezekiel, who was mumbling gibberish. Good heavens, he reported it didn't even sound like a language he had ever heard. Still calling his name, Wallace reached over and touched Ezekiel on his shoulder, which seems to have snapped him out of that strange trance. Ezekiel tried to quickly pocket the coin with the others, but not dexterous enough. After coming back to his senses, he couldn't put it away without the federal agent seeing what it was. Wallace said he just asked if he was stealing anything, but the conversation ended abruptly after a scream from Andrea from another room. Wallace and Ezekiel left the room and saw Andrea with his back against the wall in the hallway, and noticed his breathing was hard and his eyes were staring at the open door. The agent left his hand ready on his gun holster as he walked towards the room. There was blood on the floor, a trail of blood. Where did that blood came from? Could it be that they weren't alone on Beacon Island? What did Andrea, Ezekiel, and Wallace did next? We will be back shortly with the Hour of Insanity, for the follow-up of this dark story, where we will reveal secrets that the government wanted to keep hidden from you, dear listeners. So hang in there, we will be back shortly. The Hour of Insanity is brought to you by our sponsor, Contador de Histórias. There are several options for you to listen in the comfort of your home while cooking, during leisure time with the family, or just for your ears. Don't forget to follow Contador de Histórias in the most noble establishments of society, both in the Blue Bird and in the analog camera. Just look up for CDHCast. Repeating, it's CDHCast. contador de histórias, cinema for your ears. Good evening, my dear listeners. We are back with the Hour of Insanity, where reports, stories, and memories of the unexplainable travel through the airwaves to you. But be careful, because the next story could be yours. Now we will discover the end of the story, A Lighthouse in the Darkness. To remind you of what happened before, the SS Essex County ship was wrecked near Beacon Island, where we followed the misfortunes of antiques dealer Ezekiel Burke, the artist Andrea Bonucci, and federal agent under the false name of Wallace Russell. When they arrived on the island, the lighthouse was still in darkness, the rain was getting worse, and the darker side of this story was becoming more and more apparent. After they entered the lighthouse, Ezekiel found 3 Redder Strand coins on a drawer. And after they heard Andrea's scream coming from another room, they found the trail of blood. This is where our story will resume. Stay tuned, dear listeners, as we will begin the conclusion of this story. Wallace, with his hand on the gun still in its holster, turned towards the room where Andrea was looking, still panting. It was just a small kitchen, with a trail of blood on the floor that led towards a half-open door that led outside the lighthouse, towards the undergrowth. A drawer in the cabinet next to the sink was on the floor. Wallace approached and saw an empty box lying next to it. It was the box of a gun, a Smith & Wesson Model 10, according to the federal agent's testimony. The gun had been removed from there, but there was still some bullets in the box. Whoever took the gun was probably in a hurry. Why would a person be in a hurry? How were they injured? Were they running from something or going after it? The 3 men's hearts were beating faster and faster as they followed the trail of blood with their eyes, which led towards the door that led outside. Visibility was low because of the rain, but it was as if they knew something was waiting for them in the shadows of the woods. Not wasting another second, Wallace looked to the scene, looked at the others, then he nodded and walked out the door following the blood before the rain wiped its trail forever. The other men didn't have the same determination as Wallace, but they followed him anyway, as the fear of being alone was greater. The federal agents led the trio walking slowly so as not to lose track. He had noticed a strange thing that increased his fear, but he preferred not to share it with the others so as not to make those poor men more afraid. Next to the blood, he saw clearly human footprints of what happened to be a man about his height. However, after some time, a new pair of footprints had appeared on the ground. Footprints that weren't human. The description in the words of the agent was like a very large duck or some kind of amphibian like a frog. Later that same night, the 3 men would find out who those footprints belonged to. The forest was a dark and uninviting place. The beam of light from the flashlight made the shadows of trees and twisted branches dance along with the rain that continued to fall in a constant rhythm of the collision of the drops with the trees, leaves, branches, and the earth floor. The three men followed the flashlight, the only source of light in complete darkness, the further into the woods. Andrea and Ezekiel were trying to hide from the rain in their thick coats, preventing them from getting even more wet. They were focusing on the beam of light, trying not to think about the constant feeling that they were being watched, not ruling out the possibility that it was some kind of trap. Then Wallace stopped. The beam of light was flickering, pointing at something leaning against a tree. That thing was a man. Wallace's friend, Michael Turner, the federal agent working undercover on Beacon Island investigating a possible smuggling route. Michael Turner was dead. I will advise you now to get the children out of the room if you don't want them to have nightmares tonight, as I will read the description of how that trio found his body. It was a mess of blood and guts. His entrails had been pulled out of his body. They were torn and trampled in the wet earth. He still had his eyes opened, wide to be specific. His face was one of terror and panic. With the body sitting and propped up against the tree, on its right side there was a broken lamp, and on the other a gun, the Smith & Wesson Model 10, without a single bullet in its barrel. Andrea looked away as soon as he understood what the scene was about. Ezekiel, despite the grotesque scene and the fear he felt, forced himself to approach and see what the corpse had among its belongings, which would indicate what could have done that. Whereas Wallace wasn't doing well. He seemed to be in a shock. He took a deep breath, unable to look away from his dead friend in front of him. He couldn't move an inch. He couldn't do anything. Just like Ezekiel, he had entered a sort of trance. In testimony to the feds, Wallace described that he could not see anything beyond what the flashlight beam was pointing at. The world around him fell silent. That's when he heard the dead body calling his name, his real name. Trevor! 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 His mind couldn't process what was happening right in front of his eyes. What had done it? How and why? Then he heard another noise somewhere in the undergrowth, and without any warning, he drew his gun and fired into the shadows. He couldn't explain what happened. He barely remembered what had happened. When Andrea asked if he had seen anything, why he had taken that shot, Wallace just brushed it off and said they should go back. They needed to let someone know what had happened. The trio's situation was getting more and more frightening. Not even one of them said it out loud, but all of them knew that they could end up just like that. So they simply turned away, leaving Michael Turner's corpse in the undergrowth, and headed back to the lighthouse before they meet the same fate he had. But as they returned to the lighthouse, they noticed some other small buildings next to it. Maybe a shed and a storage room, they figured. They looked at each other and agreed that maybe they would find some answers there. They approached the building where they heard a low hum. They thought it could be the island's generator. When they opened the door, it was a small house that they probably used as a storage and a guest house. They actually found the generator in one of the corners. Next to it, there was a workstation with some boards, nails, and a hammer. On the ceiling there was a leak dripping very close to the generator. They also saw a simple bed attached to the opposite wall with a notebook on top of the bed. Andrea went to the side of the generator to see if there was anything useful on the workstation. Wallace went to the bed to look at the notebook, while Ezekiel didn't even set his foot inside. He stayed outside, just waiting for his colleagues to come out. From the looks of things, there was nothing much there. They could leave that little house and go back to the lighthouse in search of a radio or a telegraph to call for help. Andrea turned to head towards the door when he noticed Wallace with his eyes fixed on the small diary he had found on the bed. He looked like he was having trouble breathing. He didn't blink. He didn't even hear Andrea calling out to him, because in the pages of that diary, Wallace saw the impossible happen right before his eyes. Letters were being written in blank lines. All letters writing just one name, his own. The federal agents needed to make that stop somehow. Simply closing the diary wouldn't stop the power from evil from leaving it. If he threw the diary to the ground, maybe it would fall open, still revealing his name being written over and over again by the forces of evil. Even if he just closed it, who could guarantee that his name wouldn't still be written? Insane, he found only one way to prevent it. Throwing the diary to the ground, he drew his revolver and fired 5 shots that drowned out his scream. Andrea jerked back in fright. Ezekiel, who had not even entered upon hearing the shots, simply ran alone towards the lighthouse. Heavens, he didn't even want to know if Wallace had shot Andrea. He just knew he needed to call for help as soon as possible. Inside the guest house, Andrea jumped to his feet as he watched Wallace panting, still squeezing the trigger of the gun with no bullets against the diary on the floor. With slow steps, he approached the man, placing his hand on his shoulder. The touch on his shoulder snapped Wallace out of that kind of trance. Not knowing exactly what happened, he took a few steps back and sat down on the bed. He holstered his gun and rubbed his face and pressed his head as if trying to keep his sanity from leaving him. He didn't know what was going on. Andrea picked up the diary from the floor, but if it held any secrets, they would now be lost forever. Meanwhile, Ezekiel had run back to the lighthouse, ignoring everything around him. The trail of blood in the kitchen, the room where he found the golden coins. He went to the spiral staircase at the end of the hall and started going up the lighthouse stairs. There were several steps that seemed to lead to a small platform before the flat steps to the main platform, where the unlit lamp room was located. After some time going up, Ezekiel heard a different sound in his footsteps. It was glass, small shards and a few larger ones resting on the stairs. He knew that something had happened there. He stopped for a brief moment, gathering his strength and finding the courage to continue going up the stairs. That's when he heard the sound of the lighthouse door being opened downstairs. Could it be Wallace that came to kill him? Were his companions well and looking for a way to leave that island? Or it was the thing that killed the man in the undergrowth? Not wanting to wait for an answer and with no other way out, he went back up the stairs, leaning on the banister, going faster and faster. Ezekiel reached the small platform before the lamp room and saw, to his relief, a communication radio on top of a wooden table with a few notebooks scattered around. Beside the microphone was a small sheet with a number written on it and the name Rockport. The man turned on the radio, positioned himself in front of the microphone, pressed the talk button, and started calling for help. He told about the shipwreck, that they were trapped on Beacon Island, and that there was something killing people on the island. He was silent for some time, just waiting for an answer. No response came through the radio. He just heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. He went to the railing and saw Wallace and Andrea coming up the stairs. He sighed in relief until he remembered that he didn't have an answer from the radio. When he was about to start talking again, a voice answered from the other end.
Beacon Island! We received your message! But the storm is so strong we won't be able to send a boat until the morning! Seek shelter in a safe place and wait on the southern docks in the morning!
Clumsy Ezekiel almost dropped the microphone and went back to saying it was urgent, that they needed to send someone.
I understand, sir, but unfortunately we can't send a boat until the storm passes. Seek shelter in a safe place and wait on the south pier in the morning. Rockport out!
Anger, frustration, but at least now they had a glimpse of hope. They just needed to survive until morning came. The three men, now together again, looked at each other and up the stairs that led to the lamp room. They didn't hear any noise coming from there. The spiral staircase was the only way there. In the lamp room, they would be safer than anywhere else on the island. At least, that's what they thought. Wallace signed for the other two to wait him. He loaded his gun, and with it in hand, pointed upward, he started going up the last flight of steps to the lighthouse. A small metal grid, like a door of a trapdoor, was already open. He took a deep breath and climbed the last steps quickly, pointing the gun to the sides, wanting to surprise in case there was someone there waiting to ambush him. But he found no one, at least no one alive. Wallace lowered his gun and told Ezekiel and Andrea that they could come up. It was safe. The description you will hear now are Andrea's words in a recording at a police station about the scene. There were some larger shards on glass on the floor, although most had fallen through the openings in the metal floor. There were gunshots, marks on the lamp room ceiling, and some on the lamp itself. That was why the lighthouse had gone out. On one side was a relatively large wooden box with instructions on the side for how to change the headlight bulb. We imagined that there was the spare lamp. On the floor, what caught the attention of Ezekiel and Wallace were three bodies scattered. One of them was leaning against the glass wall with bloodstains in the shape of a hand. He probably tried to lean against the wall but ran out of strength. Ezekiel was next to this man. He looked a bit sad, but at the same time reproving the actions of that man. He later told us that he was George Cassidy, the person he knew who worked at the lighthouse. Ezekiel held the letter with the newsboy report stamp that he had taken from the inside pocket of Cassidy's coat, along with a gun. Wallace was between the two other bodies. It wasn't a very big room, you know. Anyway, that's when things got even stranger. They were things. They weren't human. They wore a thick coat, baggy shirts and pants, but they were freaks. They had a fish-like appearance. Maybe characteristics of frogs or something like that. You would say that they would have come from the sea. Both things were dead, several bullet holes in their bodies. Cassidy had probably killed the two, but his injuries were too grave to survive. Here, I drew a picture of them. I know it's a bit wet, but anyway, I think this is it. The freaks that Andrea described were Jew inhabitants of the town of Innsmouth, a town described by many as the town God-forsaken. I know, dear listener, that you must be wondering what were Innsmouthers doing on Beacon Island. Well, the letter that Ezekiel had found on the lighthouse keeper's body and smuggler George Cassidy had the answers to that. And dear listeners, I have this answer in my hands. The letter Ezekiel held was from the Newburyport Historical Society, which curates a variety of artifacts and objects. And the letter had been written by Newburyport Historical Society's head, Miss Anna Tilton. The letter was dated on April 2nd, 1926, and read as follows. Dear Mr. Cassidy, thank you for your letter dated February 28th of this year. I do in fact recognize the coin you described, or at least I recognize the design pattern of it, as we have a piece of similar origin here in our museum in Newburyport. So, as this is my belief, your coin comes from around Innsmouth, and only the residents of that ignorant town could tell its true value, to them at least. You mentioned a possible shipwreck off Beacon Island, didn't you? Perhaps it was from a vessel that left Innsmouth. However, if you value and cherish your immortal soul, I strongly advise you not to come into contact with the inhabitants of that place. Doing business with Innsmouth have never had a good outcome. Instead of that, the Newburyport Society would be happy to buy any coins you have at their market value. Of course, once their authenticity has been confirmed. If you would like to make arrangements to visit me here at the Museum of the Society as soon as is convenient for you, I can have our appraiser look over the material so that we can determine a fair price for the sale of the coins. Again, Mr. Cassidy, I urge you not to contact anyone in Innsmouth about your findings. It really is what's best for everyone involved. Yours truly, Miss Anna Tilton. The possible shipwreck Andrea had seen on their way to Beacon Island. The strange footprints in the woods. The strange coins Ezekiel had found. Everything was connected somehow and pointed to a single answer. George Cassidy contacted Innsmouth residents thinking he could get a better price for the coins he had found. But he didn't expect that he too would pay a steep price for it, his own life. A short time later, they were surprised by the sound of the wooden door at the entrance to the lighthouse being opened. Wallace ran back to the radio platform, followed by the other two more apprehensive men. As he stood next to the radio table, Wallace pointed a gun down the hall corridor when he saw one of the creatures as the dead ones in the lamp room walking towards the stairs. He yelled at the creature to stop or he would shoot. The creature didn't stop, and Wallace fired. A clean shot to the creature's head knocked it down. Everyone's nerves standing on that platform were on edge. Ezekiel himself was holding the gun, shaking, pointing down the corridor when another creature appeared. Andrea ran upstairs to the lamp room in search of another way out. He knew that at some point, Wallace's bullets would run out. If more Innsmouthers arrived, how long could they hold out? In the lamp room, he noticed the door that led to the outside. When he opened it, the wind and rain were still strong. He looked down and saw that on the lighthouse wall there were metal bars, a kind of improvised ladder which overlooked the roof of the lighthouse. From there they would be able to jump and run away. He poked his head into the lighthouse and shouted to the other two men that there was still firing at the creatures, that he had found a way out. Ezekiel looked at Wallace. He was still pointing a gun, but he had no more bullets. Wallace looked down and saw 5 more of those creatures entering. Maybe if they ran, they could find another place to hide somewhere on the island. Without thinking anymore, because every second was of the essence that night, the two men went to meet Andrea, who pointed to the stairs and started to go down. The stairs were slippery because of the rain. The wind was blowing, wanting to knock each of those men down. And it did. In a misstep by Andrea, he found himself hanging from one of the bars with just one hand. Ezekiel, who was above him, looked down just in time to see Andrea's hand let go of the bar and fall towards the roof. The rain and wind drowned out both Andrea's scream and the thump of his body hitting the tiles. The other two men could hear as if it were the wind blowing the artist's groans of pain. This made them redouble their attention so that their fate would not be the same. They managed to get down, dear listeners. Wallace ran towards Andrea to check if his condition was critical. There was blood underneath his body, and his left arm and shoulder looked broken. There wasn't much to do there, but Wallace was sure he would survive. That's when he heard Ezekiel standing beside him yelling at the creatures to go away, and then he realized that maybe none of them would survive that night. 5 creatures were standing on the ground, some meters in front of the roof they were on. With the rain and wind, they could only see the silhouette of each of them. Their faces appearing for only a brief moment, with each thunder that was heard in the skies of Beacon Island, lighting also the fear in their eyes. It was then that Ezekiel put his hand in the inside pocket of his coat and took the 3 gold coins he had found in the drawer of the house. He threw them towards the creatures and told them to take the coins and leave them alone. That was all they found. One of the creatures took a few steps, picked up the coins from the ground, and looked at Ezekiel. For a couple seconds that felt like hours, no one said anything. Then the creature turned its back and started walking towards the woods, followed by the other 4. Andrea, Ezekiel, and Wallace stood there for a while, thinking, hoping, praying that they wouldn't come back. And in fact, those creatures did not come back. They descended from the roof and went back inside the lighthouse house, sheltering from the rain, shivering from the cold of the rain that had soaked their clothes, and looking forward to the hours that passed. In time, the rain stopped. The sun came out on Beacon Island, and the 3 men went to the dock in the north of the island where they had arrived the night before and waited for the boats that came to rescue them. And thus concludes our story, A Lighthouse in the Darkness. The antiques dealer Ezekiel Berkey, the artist Andrea Bonucci, and a federal agent under the false name of Wallace Russell, who was actually called Trevor Bones, survived the night on Beacon Island and gave their statements at the Rockport police station about what happened. Yes, it's true that the 3 men survived, but their sanity was never the same. Authorities never wanted the true story of what happened on Beacon Island came out. But this is my role on this radio, dear listeners. Our commitment to the truth will not be hindered. We would like to thank you for listening to The Hour of Insanity, where reports, stories, and memories of the unexplainable travel through the airwaves to you. But be careful, because the next story could be yours. Have a good evening, dear listeners, and stay tuned for an upcoming broadcast. The Hour of Insanity is brought to you by our sponsor, Contador de Histórias. There are several options for you to listen in the comfort of your home while cooking, during leisure time with the family, or just for your ears. Don't forget to follow Contador de Histórias in the most noble establishments of society. Both in the Bluebird and in the analog camera, just look up for CDHCast. Repeating, it's CDHCast. Contador de Histórias. Cinema for your ears.